Hi everyone. I leave the word to my colleague Abdallah for the introduction of this super
Hello,
cool
everyone.
series.
This is Abdullah Al-Sharak with Dr. Maria Pia Mairano leading this session, this lecture series of the International Association for Archaeological Research in Western and Central Asia. And we would like to welcome the first of our lectures by Professor Michael Petraglia, which is entitled Early Pioneers, What We Know About Hominin Occupations in Arabia Over the Last 500,000 Years. Professor Petraglia is the director of the Australian Research Centre for Human Evolution at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. He is well known for leading and implementing large-scale interdisciplinary archaeological projects in so many parts of the world. He is very passionate about archaeology and human evolutionary studies. He taught at many universities in Europe and beyond, and he was based at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Germany. He's currently a research associate in the Human Origins Program of the Smithsonian Institution in the United States of America, and an honorary professor at the University of Queensland, Australia. Professor Petraglia received his BA in anthropology and archaeology from New York University and got his master's and PhD degrees from the University of New Mexico. He served on many boards and panels for multiple foundations and organizations. He is a very strong advocate of interdisciplinary approach in archaeology and human evolutionary studies, and his work involved partnership with the numerous national organizations and universities across many countries and continents, in partnership with scientists, climate scientists, geologists, geographers, paleontologists, biological anthropologists, and geneticists, and more. His research involved a broad range of subjects concerning human evolution, including the evolution of cognition, behavior, and the relationship between climate change and hominin dispersal. I might take the whole lecture if I keep reading from Professor Petraglia's curriculum vitae. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mike to start his talk.
Okay, thank you, my good friend Abdullah. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you, Maria, for the invitation as well. It's great to be in front of all of you, and I see you have a very exciting lecture series coming up on Arabia, and my challenge is to give you an overview on the really early history of Arabia. So I'll be talking about human occupation history, hominin occupation history over the last 500,000 years in Arabia, and what we know and what we don't know. And there's a lot we don't know too. But I hope to show you what we've been doing over the last 10 or 15 years or so now. And I just want to say a big thank you and acknowledgement to the Saudi Ministry of Culture and the Heritage Commission also for working hand in hand with us, not only permitting the work, but conducting a lot of the work that with us that I'll be showing you here today. I will go straight into the slides now. And I just wanted to give you a bit of background. We started this project in Saudi Arabia back in 2010. And so it's been ongoing since that time. There's been at least one season per year in Saudi Arabia, if not two, during certain years in this history. And we call it the Green Arabia Project. That's what it's sort of known as publicly. And also the ministry, of course, uses that term to describe what we've been doing since 2010. You'll see in the literature that we're sometimes known as the Paleo Deserts Project, and that's because the ERC sponsored 5 solid years of a lot of work in Arabia, and that ERC project was called Paleo Deserts. But nevertheless, so we're called the Green Arabia Project, and I'll get into why we call it the Green Arabia Project. But this is a large-scale project that's been happening for a while, and is highly interdisciplinary. As you see here, depicted on this map, Arabia is a key zone in terms of looking at the connections between Africa and the rest of Asia. And that's what really drew me into working in Saudi Arabia itself. And we've been conducting many years of surveys and excavations, so I'll give you an overview of what we've learned over the years now. First up, we are a very large team. There must be more than now 200 different scholars and scientists and students having participated in this project over the years. And they come from all over the world, obviously from Saudi Arabia, but also all over the world as well. I think last count I had was something like 25 different countries people were coming from. So this isn't a project that is just sourced from a single country that's, going into Saudi Arabia conducting this work. It's very international, in fact. And so that means the best people and the best laboratories have come together on the Green Arabia Project over the years. And as you'll see, we're a highly interdisciplinary group as well. This is not just archaeology. It's what I oftentimes call interdisciplinary archaeology. And here's a demonstration of that. So, when we work on looking at the history and the evolution of hominins in Arabia, we have to take a very interdisciplinary approach because, you can't tell the human story by just looking at archaeology alone. So, of course, we incorporate many fields within our own discipline, like biological anthropology, genetics, but also disciplines from the earth sciences in order to tell the environmental story through time as well. And so, when we come together as a broad interdisciplinary group, we're able to obviously put humans and hominins into some sort of historical and environmental context through time, especially when we think over the long term, over the last 500,000 years. And so why Arabia? Why choose Arabia to conduct this long-term interdisciplinary research? Well, of course, as we all know, Arabia has a very rich cultural heritage. And we've seen that demonstrated through all the work that's going on at Al Ula over the years now, and it's always in the media and in the news and in scholarly publications. So some amazing things are happening at Al Ula. But before that, the Roads of Arabia traveling exhibit around the world was really quite amazing. Because it traveled to many museums around the world. And so people saw all the fantastic history, that rich cultural heritage coming out of Arabia. And a lot of this, of course, is in the recent past, what I call the recent past of the last 10,000 years. And of course, your series is dedicated after this talk to the last 10,000 years. And it is an extraordinary record. But there's also a much longer cultural and biological record of humans being in Arabia. And right now, our oldest fossil site and archaeological site in Arabia goes back to 500,000 years, and I'll show you that site in a moment. But we have every time period, every sort of major cultural period represented in the work that we've been doing. So from 500,000 years ago, right up to the historic present. And we have, stone tools, the archaeology, the fossils, the rock art to help us tell that story of from the Paleolithic all the way into the Neolithic and younger periods. So it's obviously a fascinating cultural legacy, and that is one obviously good reason to be working in Arabia. For me, it's also a very important place, a geographic place, because it, in fact, connects Africa to the rest of Asia. It is a land bridge, and it is an important land bridge. So if you're thinking about migrations through time, for example, or cultural connections of populations in the past, you have to think about Arabia. It connects the continents. It's an intercontinental connection between early humans, modern humans, and even, obviously societies within the Holocene. So this is a very important geographic region. And so that's also one of the reasons why it really drew me in to study there. Another reason to be looking at Arabia is because of all this dramatic climatic fluctuation that happened through time. So I will show you over the last 500,000 years, you see both wet periods where we have really humid landscapes, where you see savannahs and you see grasslands and a lot of biomass. But then you see the Arabia that we know interspersed between these wet periods, the arid, the hyper-arid environments that we know of, and then the food desert and the empty quarter, so these iconic landscapes. And these arid landscapes, the landscape that we know was in Arabia plenty of times in the past, but it was interdispersed through these humid periods. So we had humid periods, arid periods, humid periods, arid periods. So we see these cycles of fluctuation through time. And this obviously would have had an effect, a major effect on human populations through time. So we have some dramatic changes in demography through time because of this significant environmental change that we see in Arabia. Another reason to be thinking about Arabia is that, and to be, in a sense, critical, is to be dispelling stereotypes, because oftentimes when, in the public mind, at least, you see people think of, when they think of Arabia, they think of Bedouin or they think of oases. But those are sort of the cultures that, of course, existed. But people oftentimes think of it as sort of a unchanging culture through time. But in fact, with our research and the research of many others, we see a lot of change through time, a lot of cultural change. And obviously, you see that in the Holocene, but you also see it in the Pleistocene over the last 500,000 years. So that idea of a static, unchanging environment, unchanging cultures, really needs to go out the window, in fact, because we see a lot of cultural dynamism in Arabia through time. And for me, looking at Arabia is really exciting because it's a place where we know little in terms of the hominins, our ancestors that were there in the past. But obviously, they would have been there because there's plenty of archaeological sites, first of all. But we also know in the Levant and in Africa, we have the fossils of representatives of not only our species, Homo sapiens, of course, but also the Neanderthals and other species like Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus. And so we find the archaeological sites representing species like these, but we have very little in the way of fossil remains of these species. And so in fact, the search is on for these fossils. We only have one fossil, which I'll show you later, a representative of Homo sapiens itself, which we found some years ago. But I'm sure through time and a lot more survey and excavation, fossils of our ancestors will in fact be unearthed in Arabia. So, we have all these reasons why we should be looking at Arabia and why I'm personally drawn to the region. This project of the Green Arabia project started back in 2010 to tackle some of these questions and to try to understand what was going on in Arabia through time. I was very happy to work in Arabia back in 2010 and getting permits from what is now called the Heritage Commission. And our permits were unusual in the sense that we were given 7 different project areas across Saudi Arabia. And we've been working in these places for a long time now. So we've been working very broadly across the peninsula, looking at different ecosystems, looking at different cultural records across the peninsula. And that was very important because you don't find the entire record in any one of these places. So in fact, you have to be sampling across landscapes, across Arabia in order to look at the last 500,000 years. So it's not continuous in any one place. And we have to build that story by looking at various places across the peninsula. And so we've worked in these various places that you see on the map, but also now in other areas as well. So we have a very good sample of landscapes across Arabia now and the cultural record. And one of the big questions we have concerns dispersal processes, the migrations of early humans and human populations into and across Arabia. And this is a process that was sort of really unknown before our project started. Because many scenarios about out of Africa migrations or migrations between Africa and Asia were really built on evidence that was coming out of the Levant or evidence that people were using to suggest coastal dispersals as the main migratory routes out of Africa and across the old world. But in fact, as you'll see in our work, we have shown that in fact river networks were used for migrations across Arabia. And you will also see evidence of ancient lakes as well, which were very important for early populations and populations of Homo sapiens as they were migrating between Africa and Asia. And they were drawn to these green landscapes where you would have had, potable water sources in the form of rivers and lakes. And if you can see on the map on the left-hand side of this PowerPoint slide, you can see that some of these migratory routes would have penetrated into the interior. So in fact, people didn't need to only move along coasts or up through the Sinai into the Levant, but they could have been walking through the heart of Arabia. And the white dots on the map just represent some Paleolithic sites that have been identified over the years in Arabia. So you can see that Paleolithic populations would have been penetrating the heart of Arabia. And on the figure on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint slide, you can see that we here have modeled through computer simulations what the environments would have been like about 125,000 years ago. And there would have been, make a long story short, a lot more rainfall 125,000 years ago. And you see a greening of the Sahara, a greening of Arabia, and that's would have drawn populations into the Sahara and into Arabia and across these zones as well, because there would have been an abundance of water in the streams and the lakes, and that would have formed savannahs and grassland environments for hunting and gathering populations. In terms of methods, how we did it, so we would do these sort of computer simulations and look at these ecosystems, but we'd also map through satellite imagery these rivers and lake systems. And once we did that sort of satellite imagery, we would go then into the field, employing mostly jeeps, but occasionally helicopters, and go to these riverine landscapes and these lake beds. And when we went to these lake beds, we would see an abundance of archaeology or fossils. In fact, on the lake beds that we've surveyed, which number in about we've surveyed about 200 or 300 lake beds now, 70% of them have some form of fossils or archaeology on them, stone tools. And so there's an abundance of archaeology out there in these hyper-arid desert landscapes. But of course, as I will show you, they were very different environments in the past. In terms of methods to reconstruct what those environments were like, we have some unpublished information where we've done some drilling operations, thanks to Saudi Aramco, in the Juba Paleolake of northern Saudi Arabia. And we've got very long records of environmental change through time. And we have at least 1 million years represented in our drill core of these fluctuating environments through time. We also have started to look at cave sites, and there are what are called speleothems in these caves, and we've drilled those speleothems. These are sort of stalactites and stalagmites in the caves, and we've drilled them, which have also given us long environmental records. In fact, amazingly, they've taken us back to 8 million years ago of environmental records in Arabia. That's also unpublished, and that's all forthcoming in terms of showing us that dramatic environmental variability through time and what effect that would have had on populations. And so now I sort of turn to what have we found? What does the actual evidence show? Well, here is a excavation conducted at a site we call Tisal. This is an ancient Paleolake deposit in the Nafud Desert. And we've dated this Paleolake deposit anywhere between 500,000 years ago and 350,000 years ago. It is the oldest known archaeological site in Arabia. So it goes back 500,000 years, and there we have a remarkable archaeological and fossiliferous site. The deposit that you can see the excavations happening on is a ancient lake bed, and that deposit extends for more than 1 kilometer, where we find fossils and stone tools, 1 kilometer in length. In fact, we've done ground penetrating radar of the dunes themselves, and we can see that lake bed going under the dunes as well. So there's well-preserved deposits under the dunes. We can't get to those deposits, and we don't need to because we've got exposed deposits, but they're very well-preserved landscapes under the dunes of these ancient lakes. And so you can see in a hyper-arid situation, there would have been a beautiful lake, a very large lake, back between 500 and 350,000 years ago. So it's quite amazing, quite dramatic environmental sequence there at this site. But what's even more amazing is that this site is highly fossiliferous. We find beautiful fossils representing all types of animals. As you can see here, some very large megafauna are represented. Ancient elephants are here, extinct forms of elephants. And you can see an elephant tusk underneath some of these lake deposits. And these are massive creatures, very large elephants that, elephant-like creatures that would have penetrated the heart of Arabia of 500,000 years ago. And obviously that evokes a very different environment than the Nafud Desert is today. But I think also amazingly, we find fish fossils as well as fossils of duck and other forms of wildlife. But we find evidence of plenty of mammals out there, but also carnivores that were following those mammals. And so what we think is going on here is that all of these animals are penetrating the heart of the Nafud when it was a green environment, when we had a standing lake, a potable lake where there was plenty of fresh water, a stable ecosystem surrounded by savannahs and grasslands, where these animals were migrating either from the Levant or Africa into the heart of Arabia. So an extraordinary fossil site, a very rare find for all of Arabia, in fact, in the Pleistocene. But what was even more remarkable for us as archaeologists was that on the fossils themselves, we have cut marks on them from stone tools being applied to bones in order to extract some of the meat off of those carcasses. And so we have this evidence of the stone tools themselves, the cut marks on bones. So we can obviously associate the early humans, these early human populations, with the animals themselves. And they're accessing meat for their diet, obviously, with those cut marks. But we actually don't know what hominin it is. We do not know the species. We do not have the fossils in all of Arabia. It's unknown what species was there. I will show you plenty of archaeological sites in this time period that we think either Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis was present on those landscapes. So these are our ancestor earlier forms of hominins that were probably widely distributed across Arabia, but we have not one single fossil representing them yet. So hopefully someone will find representatives of these species in Arabia in the near future. And so to show you yet another lake bed, this is another lake bed, that sort of whitish deposit that you can see at the bottom of the photograph, surrounded by these massive dunes in the Nafud Desert. And this person is standing on an ancient lake bed as well, a higher one. And across those surfaces, when we go to those lake beds, remember we find fossils and stone tools. And so having conducted a survey at this lake bed, what we call on the seam in the Nafud, we find this. We find plenty of evidence of hominins being there. Again, probably Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus, but these very particular large cutting tools. These are very characteristic teardrop-shaped tools, which we call hand axes. They were handheld implements, probably being used to fillet carcasses again, so accessing meat on those carcasses. And here you see a stone tool embedded in that whitish lake deposit. So no doubt about the association between them. We dated that lake, so we date the sands, we date the lake beds themselves, and this site dates to about 300,000 years ago. So a little bit younger than Tisalgata, which I showed you just previously. But again, we have plenty of evidence of some fossils and some archaeology. But this time, these handheld tools, which we call the Acheulean, which is also found in other parts of Africa and the rest of Asia. And so they're recovered in Arabia as well, likely representing these early hominins. Another look at another one of these Acheulean sites with these large teardropped hand axes, this time in central Saudi Arabia, where we've conducted some surveys of what are called dikes, volcanic dike deposits. And these volcanic dikes extend over hundreds of kilometers in central Saudi Arabia. And we went to this one volcanic dike deposit at a place called Dawadmi. And there we find those characteristic stone tools. But what was really interesting was along these dike deposits, as I said, which extend for several hundred kilometers, we find stone tools all at the base of these dikes. And again, these are these Acheulean stone tools, these early forms of stone tools. And literally, we find stone tools for at least 100 kilometers or more. So you can imagine these early hominins were coming along these dikes, and they were traveling along these river networks. They were coming into the heart of Central Arabia, and they were following these dikes. Why were they following these volcanic dikes? Well, here you go. We excavated a site at the bottom of one of these dikes, and there we had an archaeological site, which we dated to 225,000 years ago, another Acheulean site, this time the very place where these early hominins were flaking the andesite dike material. So they were going to these very large boulders at these dikes, and they were flaking them in order to fashion these hand axes. And so we have the entire process there, almost frozen in time, where the early humans would bring their hammerstones, they'd knock flakes off of the boulders, and then they would fashion these stone tools and travel along these dikes for, like I said, more than 100 kilometers along these what were once green landscapes. So they had an abundance of raw material to make their stone tools. There would have been an abundance of biomass, and they would have been traveling along green landscapes 225,000 years ago. And so that's a sort of a summary of what we've been doing for many years in Arabia in terms of the earliest periods of time. And we have filled in a lot in terms of knowledge about between the period of 500,000 and 225,000 years ago. Again, we don't have the fossils. We don't know what species it is. Is it erectus? Is it heidelbergensis? Or is it an unknown hominin species? We don't know. But we have lots of evidence of them having been there in the form of stone tools and occasional rare fossils, mammal fossils like found at Tissa Augata. There are these Acheulean toolkits, very characteristic. And so we would hope that we can put together the species with the stone tools at some point. But we have a very major gap in our knowledge still in Arabia. Despite 15 years of surveys and excavations, we know nothing about any period prior to 500,000 years ago. And we know that early humans were moving between Africa and Asia at least 2 million years ago. So, for example, there's an archaeological site in China that dates to 2.1 million years ago. It's an early archaeological site, probably from an early migration out of Africa. But we have no evidence of that in Arabia. They must have been crossing Arabia, or at least that's my hunch. I don't think they were just simply avoiding Arabia, but we know nothing about that period of time prior to 500,000 years ago. So there's plenty to do in terms of decades more of research for plenty of teams in Arabia. We've also been in search of modern humans, our own species, Homo sapiens, over the years. And this is a really interesting period of time. Obviously, if we want to understand our own species and our migrations out of Africa and how we might have utilized landscapes in Arabia through time. We have what are called Middle Paleolithic sites. These are these core and flake industries that we have dated to our team and other teams working in Arabia anywhere between 200 and 55,000 years ago. Now, we have made arguments that some of these archaeological sites, these Middle Paleolithic sites, are in fact representing our species, Homo sapiens, but it's also possible other hominins were also making these Middle Paleolithic tools, such as the Neanderthals that were living just to the north of Arabia in the Levant. But nevertheless, so I just want to give you some information about what we've been doing in terms of looking at this period of time and the origins and the migrations of our own species across Arabia. And here's one site, which we call Alathar in the Nafud Desert. Again, another one of these Paleolake deposits, these ancient lakes. And in this case, it's a very small remnant part of a lake, but it was pretty spectacular when we started to survey this particular lake bed, because there we found footprints. We found footprints of plenty of animals living along this lake bed. And so here we have trackways of elephants, for example, and wild camels. And so you can imagine, what these animals were doing along these lake beds, because obviously we have analogies to today in places like in parts of Arabia where we have domesticated camel along these water holes, but also in Africa, of course, like places like Amboseli and famous places in Eastern Africa where we see all the animals drawn to water holes. It would have been just like this in Arabia 125,000 years ago. So we dated this footprint site to 125,000 years ago, and there we have a remarkable number of trackways of different types of animals. But even more remarkable is that we discovered the first human footprints of Arabia. And we wrote a particular article on this footprint site. And again, it dates to 125,000 years ago. And so we know there was a hominin there. And again, to make a long story short, we studied these footprints, and we argued based on footprints of other species of Neanderthals and other hominins, and we looked at footprints of what we know were Homo sapiens, and we compared and contrasted them, and we argued in this particular publication therein was Homo sapiens on this lake bed 125,000 years ago. So we have a particular article on this, looking at this dispersal that happened at this very early period of time, representing our species getting out of Africa at a very early period of time. Another site which is very important in that modern human story is Awusta, another amazing lake bed surrounded by these massive dunes in the Nafud. And there we found the very first fossil of a hominin, of any species of human. And here you see a finger bone of what we called a modern human, Homo sapiens, in this particular article we published as well some years ago. We dated that finger bone directly, we dated the lake bed, and we came up with a result of about 85,000 years ago. So we not only have the first hominin fossil, we have the first representative of a fossil of Homo sapien, which is very precisely dated to an early period of time, 85,000 years ago. And what was interesting about finding that fossil is that it was on this lake. where we have the bones of other creatures like even hippos. And so we even have, so we have a picture of what other mammals were doing out there. That obviously a creature like hippos need deep freshwater deposits in order to live. And so you can imagine hunter-gatherers living around lake beds like this. Now, what was important about Augusta was not only the fossil and the mammals to give us some sense of environment, but also we found these characteristic Middle Paleolithic tools there as well. So we have an association between the Middle Paleolithic and Homo sapiens in this lake. So we know at least some of those Middle Paleolithic sites that I said were very common and abundant across Arabia are in fact being made by Homo sapiens in Arabia. And so through time, our team and other teams have found these Middle Paleolithic sites during these green periods, these wet periods in the past. And you can see here that we have found these Middle Paleolithic sites in different periods of time when Arabia was green. So each time we had cycles of humidity where there was a lot of rainfall, you find these Middle Paleolithic sites. And we suspect that at least some of these are the product of Homo sapiens itself. So every time it got green in Arabia, it would draw in these hunter-gatherer populations across those landscapes. And so we can date them, and we argue for multiple migrations across Arabia, which means populations would have been connected between Africa, Levant, and Arabia many periods of time in the past. And so Arabia has become a very important link between Africa and Asia because it's the link that has been missing in that migration story. And so we argue in many publications that it's the critical link between Africa and Asia, where we would have seen many migrations of hunter-gatherers and Homo sapiens in the past. And I just want to, this is a summary slide just showing you that these green intervals, which you see in the vertical bars in this graph, so that graph goes across a 500,000 year period, and we have these wet periods over the last 500,000 years. It would have drawn in, of course, our early ancestors, but also Homo sapiens into Arabia. And we can see that based on the stone tools that we are finding in these different green intervals. And so we have written some articles about this change through time, in the technology through time, but also the species that might have been represented in Arabia throughout time. And so we have now a developing story over the last 500,000 years of human and hominin migrations through Arabia. And obviously, a critical component, as I was saying, in Arabia are these dry intervals. So we have those green intervals, but we also, of course, have dry ones. And so if hominins and humans were living in the heart of Arabia in the past, right, during these periods when you had freshwater lakes, what happened to them? I mean, it's a question. What happened to them when it went bad, when environments turned off, when rainfall really fell off, right? And so you get the development of these very arid and hyper-arid landscapes and the deserts we know today. And so if you're an early human in the middle of the empty quarter and you're living around these lakes, you simply cannot live in them in these hyper-arid intervals. You know, everything, it dries up, there's no biomass, there's no, you just can't make a living here. So it would have had profound effects on these early populations. Either they would have gone extinct, or they would have contracted into certain zones, perhaps, of Arabia, but not everyone could have, gone to these particular smaller zones, or they would have moved on. This might have been a push factor in encouraging more migrations into other parts of Levant or Arabia through time. So you get this push and pull. You get these green periods, and then you get the arid periods. And so there would have been a lot of demographic fluctuations through time over the last 500,000 years. So this is a model that's a work in progress, but it's something that we're learning a lot more about as we do more and more field work. And I've given you an overview of a lot of the Pleistocene work we've been doing over the years. But of course, when we are doing all these surveys, we're also encountering plenty of Holocene sites as well. And I know the rest of your series is dedicated to younger periods of time, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot of what we've been doing, because we have plenty of publications and articles on the Holocene. And we think that we have both rock art and archaeological sites which represent the transition between a hunting and gathering lifestyle and the incorporation of domesticates. And so this is a key period of time, obviously, in Arabia, a big transition, because everything I've been talking about for the last 500,000 years is about hunting and gathering. And we know hunter-gatherers were in Arabia after the last glacial maximum about 18,000 years ago. So they would have come into these landscapes. They would have increased dramatically in the early Holocene, which was also a very wet period where there was plenty of rainfall. But then we get a transition where we see domesticates being incorporated into lifestyle. So we've excavated and surveyed and done a lot of rock art work where we see this transition and hunting and gathering lifestyles to the incorporation of domesticates like cattle into the lifestyle. So obviously this is the transition from hunting and gathering to pastoralism. And interestingly, on these early pastoral sites, we also have plenty of hunting and gathering going on as well. We have wild fauna in these pastoral sites where we find what we think are domesticated cattle as well. So just to turn you on to that, we've also been looking at these, what are called, we can call sacred landscapes, where there's lots of stone structures in the tens of thousands across Arabia. We've also been surveying and excavating some of these over the last few years. And there's just so much new information going on, in Alula, obviously, but also where we've been working in the Nafud. And these sites date anywhere between 7,000 years ago and 5,000 years ago, again, when we had a humid period, when landscapes were green, where pastoralism was also being a practice across the Nafud Desert. But things then get dry, and we see that even in the rock art. So changes in those pastoral lifeways with the incorporation of cattle, and we see big and dramatic changes, of course, in Arabia, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of talks about this in this series. Where we get the changes from the early Neolithic into the Chalcolithic, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. And we see that all across the Nafud. It can be beautifully documented in both oases, but also off oasis sites as well. And that's it. That's all I have to say, but thank you for your attention. And again, thank you very much. I really appreciate being the first in line in this series, and hopefully I've given you some background to the lectures that you'll be hearing. But I again want to acknowledge all the Saudi agencies and organizations that have been helping us, have been with us from 2010 all the way up until now. And so we really appreciate their support and their partnering through the years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Petraglia, for this interesting lecture about Arabia and Green Arabia over the past 500,000 years. And we open the floor for any questions or comments.